Hi, everybody. Welcome to In the Arena Live. I was gone last week, so excited to be back and joined by MK, Michelle Kwan, who, if you met her a couple of weeks back, she joined me for Michelle Mijung Kim's conversation around the wake up. And this week, we're talking about something with a little bit of a different flavor, but also kind of tangential, I guess, to the wake up, which is Olga Khazan's book called Weird: The Power of Being an Outsider in an Insider World. So I found this book through a club that I'm a part of and started looking into, what it was all about and Olga's work. And what really got me excited about it and, kind of led me to have this conversation with her was the fact that I have definitely felt weird in certain environments. And really the framing of Olga's book around weirdness, just to kind of set the stage here, is around non-conformity. So a lot of the stories as she did this research and as she, interviewed people were around choices that people made that were non-conforming choices. And so I say that to say this is very different from, the conversation MK and I had a few weeks back about, diversity and about inclusion and belonging. Different in the format that, or in the form that a lot of the focus of what we're going to be talking about today is the choices we make to show up in a way that may not conform to the rest of a group versus the things that we're born with that we could be discriminated against for. So just want to make that distinction so you know what we're talking about today. But we're really excited. I as we were talking about this, the first thing that stood out, and MK, I'd love for you to just jump in and talk about it a little bit, but it was around self-acceptance. So in this conversation, Olga and I were talking about the power of being an outsider, the choices people made, and also how difficult it can be to actually climb that mountain once you decide, like, hey, I'm going to embrace this thing that's not conforming. But that self-acceptance is really, part of, and there goes my dog. Self-acceptance is a really big part of, actually going through this process. So MK, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what stood out for you on that one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leah. And hi, everyone. So excited to be here again and chatting with Leah on Olga Khazan's episode here in the Arena. I think it's so interesting because a lot of what Olga mentions and what Olga and Leah talk about is these stories, these anecdotes of different folks who have chosen to walk the path less traveled. And so, for example, I think one really poignant example was the surgeon who has dwarfism and continued to come up against different obstacles and being underestimated and turned away from pursuing his dream. And yet he went for it anyway. And so to your question, Leah, around, where does that spark start when, whether we're younger or we find something that we're passionate about that is just weird, do we lean into it and how? And I feel like a lot of this actually stems back to positive psychology and the idea around interest. And I think, maybe, and again, this is just a perspective here, maybe a fire starter is just when you notice something that you're leaning into that you're like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm so curious about this. I want to learn more. Leaning into those feelings of awe, of interest, of wonder, and those emotions can help you start to develop your superpowers of being weird because it's a natural passion already. And I believe there might be a couple of masters on this call too. So hi to everyone who is a positive psychology enthusiast. Leah and I are both fellow positive psychology enthusiasts and practitioners and would love to see comments in the chat here too.
Yeah, I love that. MK, what is interest? That is interesting. Like,
Yeah.
is interest the same as curiosity? And I love that you mentioned the words like awe and wonder. Can you talk a little bit more about how that shows up and where it comes from?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of research around interest as a knowledge, as one of the different knowledge emotions. And so for those who are really looking into learning more about the research, Paul J. Sylvia has a ton of fantastic research around interest as a knowledge emotion. And it's kind of this idea of when something sparks your interest, essentially, and usually it might be tied around novelty, but it is a feeling, and it can be something that is fleeting. And then when you get a sustained sense of interest, it's something that you can lean into. So tying it right back to Olga's work around being weird, oftentimes, and I think everyone has these interests that are just not kind of the traditional interests. And that is a really good signal that, hey, if this is something that interests you, it might be one, a strength, but also something that if it's weird, you can lean into it. And that has all sorts of positive benefits, as we've heard from Olga's episode.
Okay, I'm going to start researching that. Of course, I'm interested in interest, but that's part of the reason we titled this, the power of your outsider story. And I see a few Mapsters that are on the call and commenting, and kind of just jumping in on the weird piece. MK, do you have any kind of things that you've been interested in that felt like they weren't going to conform, but you approached anyways?
Yeah, I think this is interesting. This is kind of a recent one too. I don't know why, but I've always liked languages. And then at one point, I started listening to a lot of different music, and specifically Korean pop music, or K-pop. And I don't tell a lot of people this, and I think it's less weird now than maybe it was a decade ago. But I think where it came up was when I used to figure skate. It was a very international group of figure skaters when I was training. And so music, of course, is such a big part of that. And people would bring in a CD with Russian rap, and people would bring in a CD when CDs were still a thing, bring in a CD with Korean pop. And it's kind of weird that is almost 80% of the music I listen to now, even though I don't speak the language. And so, Leah, to your point, I think that's one of the things that it's a little bit weird, but I love it, and I'm okay leaning into it. So I'm curious to hear about you as well. What are some things that, you've leaned into the past in terms of your weirdness?
Well, first of all, you and my niece would get along because she loves K-pop. So you're not alone.
I know.
Weirdness. I'm not pausing because there aren't any. I'm pausing probably because there's so many, and I've got to grasp one. The one I always lean towards is and that has and continues to be, my journey of, where and how I share this. So my maybe weirdness is I grew up Christian, and in my 20s, like most people, you grow up and whatever you were told when you were young, especially if you're rebellious, which I absolutely was, gets thrown away to the side. And I was like, I don't want to do anything to do with religion. But what I did find was, in my late 20s, I got really interested in just understanding different types of spirituality. Like I wanted to know, both you and I love the study of positive psychology, and my fascination is where psychology and more secular spirituality, or more varied types of spirituality combine. And so I know I'm sure you can reference a million different studies that continue to be done out of UPenn and the MAP program. But really for me, it was just deciding I was going to go study some of those things, even though I may not be the person that people would assume would show up in a room. So my prime example is I've been studying Kabbalah for 2 years. And for those of you who don't know what Kabbalah is, it is Jewish mysticism. And again, it's not for me about a religion or saying I am one or I am not. That's not my particular interest. It really is just learning what the world has to offer and deciding, what works for me, which I think is really meaningful for anyone who's curious or interested in finding out more about, meaning and purpose. I think sometimes the word spirituality scares people a little bit. So that's why, it's my path of kind of personal weirdness, or how I reveal it, because I don't want people to freak out. But I also think there's a lot of goodness in connecting to some of the kind of meaning and purpose that, many people have studied in different ways for thousands of years.
I love that. And I'm so curious, Leah, to learn more about, was there an inflection point where you felt like, this is weird, but I'm going to lean into it anyway? Was there a moment or something you read? I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, so I'd been curious about it for a while. And I was in my little, it's too weird moment. So I was like, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to show up. I'm not going, I live in New York City. There's a Kabbalah center not far from me. I was like, I'm not going, not doing it.
Yeah.
And I actually saw the book on someone's table in their apartment. And I was like, how do you it's like the core book you would read to just learn about the basics. And I was like, wait a minute, you have this book? I'm so interested in Kabbalah. This feels, kind of kismet. And then I had just this moment where, for me, it was in a difficult time that I was reaching for something that would support, me through, I love anything to do with healing, with, finding meaning, connecting to purpose, some of the kind of core things that I think a lot of people struggle with that are a little bit deeper. And so I was going through a hard time. And I said, well, this is the perfect time. And it just so happened that week that I was having this difficult experience, the Kabbalah Center was starting a course. And I said, all right. And so I also think a lot of times, and this wouldn't be uncommon, people find a lot of these, healing practices, tools, whatever they are, whether you meditate or you tap or you write or you exercise, whatever the thing you do to connect to yourself and heal. A lot of times I think people find them in the darker moments in life and they support you through them. And then they have this kind of imprint on you because of that.
Yeah, I love that. And that ties right back into this idea that Olga mentioned around self-acceptance, right? Is that sometimes when you're looking for something, around you, the environment or in the universe to say, here, I want to lean into this, but I'm a little bit afraid. There's a little bit of a signal. And then you realize, oh, this is just part of who I am and I need to lean into it. And so that story that you mentioned of finding a book, that just gave you that extra little nudge to say, you know what, this is something that I need right now. And now here you are. That's awesome.
And here I am. Yeah. And then after a while, it's interesting, right? Like this is like, it's so funny how fear works, right? It's like it builds up in your mind over a long period of time. And so the more you stay away from the thing you have interest in, whatever it is, the more the fear builds up, the less likely you are to do it. And when you actually pull the trigger and go do the thing, all of a sudden the fear starts to vanish, or it vanishes altogether right away. And you realize it was literally just a prison that you were locking yourself in, and it's sort of its own liberation, which is in that self-acceptance piece of, I am not, I am not my interests, but I have interests, right? And it's okay for me to have interests that are different from maybe what people expect. And in fact, I could imagine, MK, you've had this experience, maybe with K-pop. Who knows who started listening to K-pop because you said, yeah, I listen to K-pop. So it's sort of this also permission giving.
Yeah. It's, I think that's true. I think it's permission giving to yourself. And then I think in both of our stories too, there's usually maybe someone else, like one or two other people that either embrace your weirdness and celebrate it, or at least are curious about it in a positive way, versus feeling like you're fully shut out. And so I think, going back to Olga's title around kind of being that outsider in an insider world, you just need to jump in a little bit. And Olga mentions this idea, and I love this idea of idiosyncrasy credits, which I know we chatted about briefly, where it's kind of like fake it till you make it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Leah. But essentially, idiosyncrasy credits is where you are just trying to become part of a group or community. And so you start kind of making those connections, building that trust and gaining the trust of those members. And then you kind of show off your authentic weirdness. And I think that probably happens more often than we realize in work, in a new program, or a new if you're moving to a new community. I think that shows up a lot.
Oh, for sure. I think she used but I'm like looking at everyone's. So Ted Lasso. Yeah. All right. I still haven't watched Ted Lasso, Anton, but I hear it's a must.
It's fantastic. It's funny. I just watched it maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it's probably the most positive psychology-esque show out there right now that I could think. It's fantastic.
Oh, wow.
So highly recommend it. And Anton, great call out. Be curious, not judgmental.
It's happening this weekend. Okay. And we got to find the writers of that show. Maybe that's a guest for the podcast. So yeah, what's interesting is as you're talking about this, and I think because you said interesting at the beginning of this conversation, you and I have used the word interesting way more than we probably would. Probably. But now I'm attached to it. So when you are, in my experience, when there have been things that have been different about me, especially as I've explored myself, and just understanding more of who I am. And, I think you kind of hit this point, and I think it happens for everyone at different points in life. But as you mature and, and go through these kind of stages in your own development, you go back to, I don't know, I kind of had this almost, when you're a teenager, you're trying to figure out who you are. I feel like that happens again, like a decade or so later.
Totally. And again and again and again.
And probably again, yeah, exactly. Like until you realize that you aren't anyone at all. Like you're just figuring it all out. So I noticed that the scariest places to show my weirdness were actually with some of the people I was closest to, which is really interesting. So when it came to like family, right? There's this sort of expectation of who you are, and almost this expectation that you'll stay as you are. And so you mentioned like the people around you that are accepting of your weirdness. What I've noticed is it's easier for me to embrace it when the people around me are a little bit weaker tied. Maybe that's like tied to risk or to like less risk because it's a weaker tie, but there's still support there. Like, have you ever had that experience, or have you thought about that?
I think I actually haven't thought about that. So this is super interesting because I think you're onto something here, Leah. This idea of someone who's so close to me, who has known me so well, maybe there's this unrevealed or developing part of me that's weird that I don't want to get in the way of our strong relation. Like, I don't want to rock the boat on this in any way. You know what I mean? And so that's really interesting. I've actually never thought about it in terms of a risk of now, how does this affect the relationship or the friendship? Yeah.
Well, you think about like if anyone listening has gone home, or goes home, or if you live at home, whatever it is, and you're home and you're with your family of origin or the people who raised you, whoever those people are, or even just close friends that you've known since like your adolescence, there's kind of a regression that happens. Like, right. And I think, Rachel just said it. It's a risk of changing identity, right? That's the scary thing is like, I am different. And so now does that put our relationship at risk? But it's interesting to like, think about when you go home, you sort of slip back into the role you played as a child. And there's like lots of research on this, right? So like, how do you slip back into the things that were common for you to do, say, or how you were being when you were young, right? When it was sort of cemented. And I think it really maybe is like an effort to keep the family and keep the health of the ties, because we make up that the ties will change if we change.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a sense of that. And Olga, I think, talks a little bit about this too. And I'd love to unpack this more, this idea of tightness and looseness and having certain rules and norms and expectations that are kind of often unspoken. And so when you think about your family, your nuclear family is kind of that's
like the tightest.
Exactly. It's the tightest, right? Yeah. And so it's so easy to slip back into, mannerisms, sayings, inside jokes from decades ago, because that's just what everyone's known. And it's certainly a sense of comfort, but of course, obviously tied to the group's identity. And so it is, I mean, there's so many movies about, whether it's like the cheesy holiday movie about someone going home and saying that, they're now doing something completely different, or they quit their job and went on this completely different path, or, Eat, Pray, Love. I don't know. There's just so many movies of the kind of learning journey, that kind of identity journey that comes with taking the path less traveled and then having to show up in front of your closest family and friends and say, yep, I'm different now. However, that might be, however, small, or maybe like fully identity changing that might be too.
Yeah, I think there's like, well, first of all, I think my uncle tells the same like 3 stories every Thanksgiving and Christmas, all from like 1970, all the same stories. I have them memorized. And it's no wonder then that I also slip back into my own like silly, goofy self that I was as a kid. And don't embrace some of the things that even I study today, and talk about those things all the time. I talk about them sometimes, but it's not super often. Which brings me to the like our kind of second piece that you and I started talking about. And I think it's really important. The way that I think about embracing our own differences or our own weirdness, is that you can't give what you don't have. So if you're not accepting of your own differences or the things that make you unique or strange or could potentially put you at risk for being an outsider in a group that could be a little bit tighter. So you think about like a club or, church, whatever it is that you do, if that you do or that you're engaged in, um, you're less likely to accept other people who are trying to embrace that, right? And less likely to give them permission to actually embrace that. And so there's this idea of like, how do we give people permission? I think you said it in this way of, when you see the light in someone's eyes, that's something that they're curious about or they're interested in. How do you decide to show up for them, even though it may not be what interests you? And do you have recommendations, MK, for how we do that?
Yeah, I think, and by no means am I an expert on this. I just know that I am curious about so many different things, and so it almost comes naturally to me. But I think, even tying it back to our workplaces or our communities outside of work, when someone you kind of have like there's this gut instinct when someone's about to be vulnerable or has just been vulnerable. You can read it in their nonverbals. You can get a sense of the room, whether it's virtual or in person. And I think there's a moment for everyone to choose, do I want to embrace this person and their weirdness and their vulnerability and accept them so that they can lean more into their self-acceptance and continue to be authentically weird? Or do I want to not do anything? And I feel like it's in that moment. So to your question, Leah, like, are there things you can do? It's being aware of those small moments and then leaning in a positive way and saying, whether it's asking questions or, I'd love to see that. I'd love to read that book about Kabbalah. Can you show me, can you share a summary with me or share the title of the book with me? I'd love to know more. It's just those tiny bits of encouragement that I think help people celebrate that a little bit more and feel more comfortable in their own skin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. You're the idea of digging in a little bit more and saying like, hey, can you tell me more about this? Or even just like the simple, I mean, I notice like most of the time, I don't really need people to walk the whole journey with me. I just need a moment. And you're sort of alluding to like, if you're familiar with John Gottman's research and the Gottman Institute, he researches relationships and love and marriage. But one of the things he talks about is bids for connection. And it kind of reminds me of bids for connection, which are, if you think about it, it's like those sliding door moments where, someone tries to bring something to you, they extend that olive branch, and you're either conscious and aware, and maybe you decide not to take it because you just don't want to, or you're conscious and aware and you take it, or you're totally unconscious and the moment passes, right? And those are sort of the moments in which, we build trust. And then, like Rachel said, seeing the light and fanning the flame, right? Your flame gets fanned in that sliding door moment. And then you don't really need somebody to like walk the whole path with you. You just needed someone to say, cool, go do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Rachel mentioned active constructive responding as well. It's that way to lean in and respond when someone shares something, whether, especially if it's a positive thing. It's just, just again, continuing to provide that sense of self-confidence and support. And I think, Leah, you as a coach, I'm sure you practice this too, or you kind of take bits and pieces of this in terms of building that connection and also leaning in to ask powerful questions that can help someone, become more comfortable and figure out what their superpowers are, whether it's certain aspects of weirdness or not.
Yeah. Well, and the only way for me to have done that, it's funny, when you become a coach, I always say, I'm like, talking to people who want to be coaches. When I wanted to be a coach, it was because I wanted to go give advice, which is hysterical once you start coaches training, because you realize not only are you not giving anyone advice, you also needed the coaching all along. Like you were the person that needed it. And that leads to your own kind of self-acceptance. So yeah, when I'm coaching someone or working with them, I don't really care what it is they want to explore. I just want them to be okay with taking the step towards becoming more of who they are. Like, it doesn't matter to me, I have no judgment is what I'm saying attached to it, because it's really about them becoming and not about me, being in that story and having a say. But that's only because I've also had to deal with my own experiences, which is kind of back to the you can't give what you don't have. And I think, MK, what you've said a few times and what we're really talking about here, and what we talk about on most of this show and on the podcast is awareness.
Yeah.
Like it's such a simple thing. It's simple but not easy, and it has to be consciously done. But being aware of who you are, being aware enough to think about how you want to show up. I mean, I swear, I think my dog barking is some lesson that I'm meant to learn about life and about showing up imperfectly.
It's all good.
One
Being
day we'll
present.
all meet her.
Yeah.
But I think it's about, trying to, understanding, how we reflect on who we are, how we become more aware of who we are, and then how we invite others to also step into their own, ownness of who they are. And part of that what that really allows is all of us to actually become better humans. So the awareness is really about how you self-develop and how we collectively develop as we keep kind of waking up to the ways in which we might be dampening out our own flames or dampening out the flames of others. So with that, MK, shall we move into the action?
Yes, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So this one was fun. I will drop this into the chat afterwards and we're going to show it up here. But if you're watching live or you're watching later, either way, it's great. I want you to just think about, when you talk about awareness, reflection is a really meaningful part of awareness, right? So, and when I say reflection, get it out of your head and onto paper or onto your phone in your notes section, but don't keep it in your head. That's not necessarily how you kind of start to integrate the reflection. So I want you to think about an area of your life where you have some sort of unrevealed weirdness. And again, this doesn't have to be some huge thing that, if you revealed it, it would rock your world. Like I might actually encourage you to start a little bit smaller and continue to use this framework or process going forward. So when you have that story in your mind, what I love to use is a process by someone named Byron Katie, which if you haven't heard of her, absolutely look her up. She has a process called The Work. And The Work has a set of questions that are really simple, but really powerful to support us in understanding what our beliefs do to us and how they keep us small. So the questions are, when you think about that belief, or about your weirdness, what is the belief that you have about revealing this weirdness? So for example, it could be, with MK and K-pop, it could be the belief that, she reveals that she likes K-pop, she may be putting relationships at risk, right? People might not like her, or they might not want to listen to music around her because they don't want to hear K-pop, right? And the second question she'd ask it herself is it true? Now, there's a difference between I'm buying into it being true and it actually being true, which is why there's another question that is it 100% true? Can you be absolutely certain that this is true, right? And the answer generally is no. And then these are the two questions that are really meaningful. So how do you show up when you buy into the belief that it's true? And the way you can start to break this down is, how do you think, act, and feel when you buy into the belief that it's true, right? So, for mine, it might be with, being afraid to share about the fact that I study lots of spiritual paths could make me buy into a belief that if I share this with people, they won't like me or they don't want to talk to me. How do I show up? I hide. I don't talk about it. I keep it a secret. I might skirt questions about it, right? So I show up a little more frenetic, maybe skittish. And the final question, which I think is the most empowering question, so simple: who would you be without that belief? Who would you be without the belief that if you revealed this part of your weirdness, X, Y, and Z would happen that are all just catastrophes you're probably making up in your head? So I would say, just playing with this 5-step process. I've done it with things so small and really big, meaningful things. This is not meant to be a replacement for, therapy, or trauma work. So I want to just make that clear, but it's a really meaningful and simple way to just start pulling apart some of the areas in which you might be hiding, but have no real reason to do so. So with that, we are at 30 minutes after. We have so enjoyed being here. MK, I loved having you here. And I love that you brought your positive psychology crew, because I'm loving all the comments.
Of course. Thanks everyone for joining, Mapsters. Love seeing the comments. Love learning from all of you as well.
100%. All right. So we will see you all next Thursday. Thanks so much for being here. And hope you have a great day and enjoy the process.